if the Trump administration is playing a zero-sum game in Sino-US relations, the Biden administration is more likely to deal with the bilateral relations of competition and cooperation.
The guest of discussion with us today is Wang Yongqin, a professor from the School of Economics of Fudan University. Wang Yongqin, Professor, School of Economics, Fudan University, PhD tutor, Director of the Research Center of Green Court in Emerging Financial Formats, Fudan University.
Finance opening should be cautious of the big surpassing countries.
In the process of competition and game with the United States, how can China avoid stepping into the trap of surpassing countries? What can we learn from the competition among the United States, Japan, Britain and Germany?
The current competition pattern between China and the United States is very similar to the relationship between the United States and Japan in the late 1980s. In 1979, Professor Fu Gaoyi, an expert in China at Harvard University, studied the economic development of Asia and wrote a book entitled Japan First, Enlightening to the United States. At that time, the academic and political circles in the United States felt that Japan's development was irresistible. From the late of 1950s to the late of 1960s, in 20th century, Japan's real GDP growth rate maintained an average annual growth rate of 10%. And its annual average growth rate from 1955 to 1970 was also as high as 9.6%, which is very similar to the situation in China's reform and opening up for more than 40 years. At the same time, under the times of the catching up and surpassing economy, both China and Japan adopted the developing country strategy led by the government. From the perspective of great history, Germany actually adopted this strategy in catching up with Britain. At that time, Germany was also a backward country. There were numerous princes in the country, and customs checkpoints and tolls were set up among independent regions. In 1871, Germany was unified, and Bismarck, the Prime Minister of Iron and Blood, began to integrate at home. The development mode of state intervention was also adopted abroad. In a few decades, Germany's economy surpassed that of Britain. The economic development Germany, Japan, China and other countries is similar. In a short period of 30 to 40 years, the economy has grown rapidly, with an annual growth rate of more than 5%, 6%. However, due to their high dependence on foreign trade, once these countries encounter negative external shocks, such as the global financial crisis in 2008, and its original leverage level is relatively high, the speed of their economic development will fall precipitously. Japan's economic bubble was also caused by excessive leverage. Today's China is very similar to Japan at that time, especially for high debt leverage in real estate as collateral. Relatively speaking, there are very big differences in the growth patterns of the two types of countries, such as Britain and the United States, Japan and Germany. Under period time of the Anglo-American model, government as intervention is relatively less, and its economy has maintained a slow and sustained growth for 100 years. For example, the U.S. economy had grown steadily at an average annual rate of 2% to 3% over the past 100 years. However, under the mode of government-oriented economy in Japan, the economy would grow at a high speed for more than 30 years. But after that, the economic growth rate would have a big drop. Take Japan as an example. From the bursting of the economic bubble in the 1990s as till now about 30 years, the Japanese economy has almost zero growth. In addition, it is worth mentioning that China and Japan are very similar in terms of financial development. The finance for both countries is not developed well enough, and residents do not have good means to resolve their own risks. That is, the capitalism is difficult to be converted into investment, but avoided by saving. Because of the insufficient domestic needs, products and services that cannot be consumed at home can only be exported overseas. Countries with high savings rate will inevitably have trade surplus. Similarly, once the big underdeveloped trading countries, such as Japan, loosen foreign exchange control, opens capital account, free flow of domestic and foreign capital, interest rates, borrowing costs and exchange rates will rise correspondingly, which will hit exports and hinder economic development. This is exactly what happened after Japan signed the Plaza Agreement. In terms of financial opening up, China should learn the lessons of Japan, carrying out financial opening cautiously. In addition, because of the existence for foreign exchange controlling, Chinese people cannot go overseas to buy real estate and invest stocks. However, the maturity of domestic financial market is so low that people take real estate as investment goods, and the housing bubble is seriously relatively. But if China's capital account opens, there may be capital flight. China has experienced a very serious capital flight from 2014 to 2015, which caused China's foreign exchange reserves dropped from nearly $4 trillion to $3.3 trillion. An important lesson we have learned from Japan's experience is that financial openness must be prudent. Otherwise it is easily to disrupt domestic relative prices and trigger the collapse of asset bubbles. Because in the past 2 or 3 decades, land and housing have been the most important collateral for bank financing and loans in China. If the real estate price falls sharply, the bank will have a lot of debts, and the debt problem will be more serious. Zero-sum game, science and technology dispute and currency dominance.
China's gradual mastery of the leading edge in breakthrough innovation has aroused the concern of the United States. What does it mean to contain the list of entities in China's development? In which areas will the United States worry about China's leading edge?
Historically speaking, if the competition among countries is limited to commodity trade, it will not be so worried. Because the pure trade surplus is a financial problem. If a country's finance is developed, savings will be less, and the country's trade deficit will be formed. Therefore, the trade deficit is not the weakness of the United States, but reflects the strong financial position of the United States and the imbalance of international financial development. If technology leadership and currency dominance can help China become an irreplaceable first-class power country, elites in the US government, politics and other fields will be very worried. On the one hand, China is likely to take the lead in setting standards for disruptive technologies, which worries the US government. If China makes major breakthroughs in 5G, artificial intelligence, digital economy and other fields, it will become a world standard setter. Then the United States will be very passive. From the historical point of view, the technology in standard setting is very important. The reason why Germany surpassed Britain in that year was that it had the dominant power in the technical standard setting. The dominant power of formulating technical standards has the effect of winner takes all. The worry of the US government can be seen from the US blockade of Huawei in the last 2 years. At present, the chip technology for the United States is still far ahead. Although Trump's restrictions on China's technology have brought huge losses to Silicon Valley companies, he prefers to block China's technological rising by killing 1,000 enemies and losing 800. On the other hand, the possibility of RMB becoming the world's leading currency in the future also worries other major economic countries. Generally speaking, for the world economy leading countries, whose GDP ranks first in the world and who will dominate, although this historical process may take a long time. For example, the pound used to be the most circulated currency in the world, and was later replaced by the hegemony of the US dollar. Although the transfer of currency is a long process, and if RMB has the functions of global trade settlement, commodity pricing and bond issuance, its privileged status will be gradually established. Once RMB becomes the dominant currency, the US dollar, with its financial hegemony, will withdraw from the stage of history. Biden's policy is more constructive in the dance of competition and cooperation.
At present, Kirin chip is out of print, and it is difficult to achieve the chip developing technology in a short time. How do you see the situation of high-tech enterprises on the list of entities such as Huawei in the Biden era?
The country as developing cannot bypass the research of the chip. China must vigorously develop the chip industry. The situation under Biden will be relatively optimistic. Trump adopted the America First policy, but it may not be the political strategy for the Democratic Party. Biden wants to solve many current practical problems, such as domestic income gap, global warming, to make the United States lead the world again. He may rejoin the Paris Agreement and seek global cooperation in other areas, all of which require China's participation. If Trump plays a zero-sum game in Sino-US relations, Biden is more likely to deal with the bilateral relations with competition and cooperation. Therefore, I am relatively optimistic in this aspect.
Therefore, do you think there is no so-called hard decoupling between China and the United States?
Yes, I think the statement of decoupling is exaggerated. Looking at all kinds of data, it can be found that in the past 2 years, China and the United States have not decoupled, and some aspects of the relationship have become closer, especially in the financial field. The amount of US investment in China is far more than that in previous years, especially since the outbreak. Many American financial institutions have invested in Chinese bonds and stocks because they see that the Chinese market is more reliable in the volatility of the world. However, it is unlikely that the United States try to exclude China through the SWIFT clearing system and CHIPS payment system, because there is always you and me in the trade of cross-border transactions. In the economic aspect, it is difficult to realize the decoupling of trade and division of labor. On a global scale, it is difficult to find a country with a complete industrial chain like China. When Trump took office, he talked with CEOs of major American companies to move their overseas factories back to the United States. Apple CEO Cook made it clear at the time that it was impossible, because China's comprehensive advantages in infrastructure, industrial chain and labor cost are much better compared with other economies. It can be found from the data that Trump originally wanted to eliminate or reduce the trade deficit of the United States. But in fact, the trade deficit of the United States has become more serious in recent years. In August 2020, the U.S. trade deficit jumped by 5.9% to US $67.1 billion, the highest level since August 2006. Because U.S. companies may pay more to import parts from other countries. Therefore, a large-scale decoupling between China and the United States is unrealistic.
What kind of new pattern do you think will be formed in Sino-US relations during the Biden period compared with the Trump administration?
Generally speaking, the policy of the Democratic Party is more rational, and the uncertainty of Sino-US relations will decline in the future. Different from Trump's treacherous and dramatic strategy, Biden's policy uncertainty will be reduced, and the relationship between the two countries will show more features of competition and cooperation rather than zero-sum. In terms of policy, Biden will give priority to domestic economic problems and epidemic response in the United States, and adopt a larger fiscal stimulus plan. Fade away the Asian century and the rise of China.
What do you think China can do to enhance its position in the global value chain?
In fact, compared with the past 20 or 30 years, China's industrial chain and technology have progressed very fast in recent years. The central government has taken high-quality development as the core content of development in the future stage. I think that scientific and technological innovation should be used to promote the development of China's economy, enhancing the role of innovation in restructuring the value chain, and integrate resources globally. If the eastern region of China can improve the ability of independent R&D and design, it can also achieve the highest industrial chain like Apple, and then outsource some of the production links to the central and western regions, even other developing countries. In fact, it has happened already. This is also the only way for China to overcome the middle-income trap and become an innovation-oriented country in the future, just like the innovation road taken by South Korea's big enterprises dominated by Samsung. In this process, the government needs to strengthen the protection of intellectual property rights, industry-university research cooperation, and support the innovation of private enterprises in financing. Asia is far less integrated than Europe. After the Second World War, the European integration mainly promoted by France and Germany embodying in the unification of European community, European Union and currency. Previously, Asia's cooperation in this area has not been particularly well. Recently, due to the relation of the United States, regional cooperation in Asia is speeding up. Other Asian countries see that China's rise as a great power has become unstoppable. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, RCEP, reached by 15 member states, including China, will have an important impact on China's industrial chain reconstruction and the industrial restructuring of the whole Asian region through the free trade agreement. And the Asian century is becoming a reality. Around 2050, Asia's GDP is likely to surpass all other regions and reach half of the world's. From the perspective of world structure, there are two kinds of trade system arrangements. One is the multilateral system of WTO, who treats all member states equally. The institutional arrangement of WTO is too restrictive to negotiate on the unique bilateral conditions, which leads to many countries' unwillingness to join. So at present, the operation of WTO is not successful. After the Doha talks, many countries are looking for regional free trade agreements, FTA, which are more suitable for their actual situation. Therefore, it is becoming a trend that bilateral or regional FTA will gradually replace WTO. China's initiative to join RCEP has been in the forefront of the world. Asia has all kinds of levels, developing stages of countries, and regional FTA is conducive to the division of labor in Asian industrial chain.
What do you think of China's dual cycle strategy, especially the impact of internal circulation on China's future economic structure?
I think that, even if there is no trade conflict between China and the United States, double circulation is imperative for China's current situation. Generally speaking, large economic development relies on domestic demand, while China's trade dependence is very high. Therefore, China's economy needs to be rebalanced and adjusted to a structure that relies mainly on domestic demand. Tax and debt are the two biggest obstacles to the internal circulation strategy. First of all, we should narrow the income gap through tax reform. The tax burden will restrain consumption. There are many problems in China's tax system. The tax burden of income tax falls on the middle class, but the tax burden, particularly for rich class, is relatively low. I suggest a more progressive tax system to narrow the income gap and increase domestic demand. Second, we should control and reduce the scale of household debt. In 2007, China's total household debt was less than 4 trillion yuan. At the end of 2018, China's total household debt was 73.65 trillion yuan, accounting for 82% of GDP and 187% of household disposable income. The growth rate was too fast. The main reason is that during the financial crisis in 2008, China did not implement tax cuts and financial subsidies like the United States, but use a 4 trillion plan to stimulate local government, enterprise and household debt. China's housing prices have increased to double price, and 70% to 80% of household debt is used for housing mortgage loans. If the problems of high household debt and roaring real estate cannot be improved, consumption cannot be stimulated, then internal circulation will be restricted. Historical experience shows that most economic recessions are related to high household debt. In this regard, China needs to learn from the collapse of the U.S. housing mortgage market and effectively control household debt leverage to enhance domestic demand.